What's really good, folks? Radio Free Innsmouth, episode 336. And this week, we're going to be talking about Marduk. That's right, we're going to be flushing our black metal cred down the toilet, because apart from Cradle of Filth and Dark Funeral, or as I like to call them, Dork Funeral.
You are correct, sir.
And maybe later Satyricon, there's not been a band on Earth that's been held up more often as an example of black metal jumping the shark than friggin' Marduk, at least when it comes to a lot of the more hardcore members of the black metal fan base. And I mean, I myself, I've lumped Marduk in with Dark Funeral as the butt of many a black metal joke in the past. Marduk were kind of important to my early experience as a black metal enthusiast. I mean, Heaven Shall Burn When We Are Gathered, the fourth Marduk album, was actually the third black metal album I ever listened to after I found out that black metal was considered a separate genre. The first two were In the Night Side Eclipse by Emperor and Aspera Hiem Symphonia by Arcturus. Before that, I had been listening to Celtic Frost, Merciful Fate, and through my early on love of Nile, Melakesh and Absu, but I didn't know what the heck a black metal was at that point in time. So Marduk, specifically Heaven Shall Burn, back through like their first few albums, was always kind of part of my black metal listening regimen from a pretty early age. They kind of went from, oh my god, this is the coolest thing ever, guys, to sort of a rainy day, guilty pleasure style listen over the years as I got into more obscure stuff. But last week, I was having a particularly rough time with a lot of personal logistical stuff going on, and I happened to pull out some of my old Marduk albums, kind of as like a black metal comfort food type thing. And honestly, there is some interesting stuff going on with Marduk. Hopefully, I will be able to convince you that over the course of what's probably going to be a two-part series. Because Marduk, yeah, it's not Burzum, it's not Dark Throne, it ain't no Blazebirth Hall, it ain't no Graveland, but they were one of the earliest purveyors of what we nowadays call second wave black metal. And honestly, as much flack as they get, I would say for their first 7 albums, they managed to maintain a pretty impressive level of musical and artistic quality, which is not something you can say for a lot of the older black metal bands. Also, Marduk doesn't really seem like the kind of band that gets a lot of deep dive style coverage on their discography, so I feel like I'm filling a bit of an artistic void here. Speaking of not a lot of really deep coverage going on with this band, when was the last time you heard somebody talk about early Marduk? Not those of the Unlight or Opus Nocturne or Heaven Shall Burn era Marduk. I'm talking the real old school first era of Marduk, which I would put down as their demo, the Here's No Peace single, which technically wasn't officially released until 1997, but did have an advanced tape circulated through the underground dating back to 1991, and the Dark Endless album. You can kind of think of this as being the death metal era of Marduk, much as was the case with Dark Throne, where their demos and their first album were definitely more death metal than black metal. In the case of Dark Throne, for a long time, it seems like people really ignored the Soulside Journey era of Dark Throne, and then nowadays, you got a lot of death metal goofballs trying to tell me that Soulside Journey is the only good Dark Throne album, which is a massive and unnecessary course correction. I mean, if you can't get down with To Walk the Infernal Fields or In the Shadow of the Horns,
Just get lost, brah, brah.
However, there's never really been a large-scale reevaluation of Marduk's death metal era in the underground, at least as far as I've seen. And I do think it's an era of Marduk that necessitates some discussion. Daniel Ekeroth's book, Swedish Death Metal, is a pretty important historical document as far as like the early era of Swedish death metal and even a little bit of Swedish black metal goes, despite the fact that his takes on black metal are almost uniformly trash, as is often the case with death metal people talking about black metal. And he's got some pretty interesting coverage of this early era of Marduk on page 253, 254-ish, where he actually interviews Dan Svano from Edge of Sanity, who recorded all this early Marduk stuff. According to Dan, at the time, their main influences were death metal bands, specifically Master, Unleashed, and Grave, and the black metal aesthetics and all the satanic stuff was more just aesthetic dressing. Does this assessment bear out when you're actually listening to early Marduk?
Let's find out.
So here's one of the biggest early Marduk songs within the Abyss, and I'm definitely hearing some Swedish death metal type stuff going on. In fact, the vocalist for this era of Marduk is actually more famous for being one of the guitarists in Dan Spano's death metal band's Edge of Sanity. But then it gets into the fast parts, which are very non-Swedish sounding, actually have a decent amount of grindcore to them from what I could hear. And then when it jumps back into the slower bits, it's death metal, but it's not really standard Swedish death metal. It has a much more dark sort of atmosphere to it, to the point where if you didn't see the Marduk label, you could be forgiven for thinking this was a Finnish band, like Abhorrence or something. And again, back into those fast bits, which are to my ears very grindcore-ish, but also more so by virtue of the date of recording than anything else. Could be considered as first wave chaotic black metal adjacent to an extent, you know, like Blasphemy or Sarcophago kinda. But yeah, overall that song in particular definitely way more death metal than black metal. But as you move on through some of this demo and first era of Marduk's discography, you start noticing some interesting things. Like this riff right here, okay, that is 100% fucking black metal, more so than any other genre of extreme music. But then it goes into the slow part, and that's definitely fucking death metal. And even when they speed it back up, it's still much more death metal than black metal sounding to my ears. Kind of that Central European sort of gore polka style with the drums. A pattern also starts to emerge in this era of Marduk of alternating slow and fast section, like this rather mystical sounding bit right here, which then leads into another fast section of, again, very death metal-ish, almost kind of grindcore-y, very churning sort of chromatic riffage. Not very black metal at all, but then when it slows down again, I don't know if you could call this black metal, more so than doomy death metal, but there is a much more black metal sort of focus on consonant melody than you would normally find in death metal. Very mythical, epic sort of sound to it, before then going back into, you know, the more obviously death metal style stuff. So overall, yeah, it's death metal, but as much as I kind of hate how overused this term gets, and how kind of corny it sounds, blackened death metal, it makes me think you know, blackening spices on fish or something. Generally, kind of a little bit too crude of a term than what I would normally like to use, but I think if there's any album that term could apply to, it would be the first Marduk album, Dark Endless, which features both re-recordings of demo-era songs and new songs, both of which really lean into that kind of mystical, mythical, esoteric vibe that was hinted at in their demos, particularly during the slower parts of songs. This fast bit right here, again, pretty much pure black metal. Then it goes into a more mid-paced, sort of doomy death metal kind of thing. But despite being doomy death metal, it has that sort of black metal atmosphere to it, particularly during the following section where it takes on a very medieval sort of cast that I wasn't really hearing in death metal from the time period from any other band. Like, as much as Marduk is famous nowadays for being this hyper-fast fucking black metal band, honestly, in an alternate history sort of world, I could have seen these guys ended up being a really good doom death band. Like, this whole transition section right here definitely stands up very well next to bands like Oxfix or Eternal Darkness. Then we bring in slower sort of rolling double bass, and you get some really unique sounding stuff, which I would say is black metal in its own right, but not Scandinavian black metal in its typical form, almost more Mediterranean sounding, like Mortuary Drape or something like that. Maybe even Passage to Arcturo era Rotting Christ. And from there you get into probably the most second wave black metal sounding riff of the album. As much as I've said that, yeah, this is death metal, that's death metal, this is death doom, what you're hearing right now, that's straight up second wave Nordic black metal stuff. And that whole like weird mix of styles coupled with that really cool sort of like mystical vibe they've got on this album actually makes it for me one of the more interesting Marduk albums, and I'm kind of surprised that people don't really talk about it as much. I mean, prior to doing my research for this episode, even I didn't really listen to this album all that often. I'm gonna have to change that because honestly, this is some pretty cool shit. But that's era one of Marduk. From there, we move on to sort of like the classical, unequivocally black metal era of Marduk. Their original vocalist Dread leaves to concentrate solely on Edge of Sanity, and this further establishes guitarist Morgan Håkansson being like the Marduk guy. You can change everybody around them, but Marduk is always going to be Morgan's band. They pick up a new vocalist, Jokke Goldberg, and a new bassist, B-War, both of whom would be very important for this era of Marduk, and they put out 2 albums in this era, those of the Unlight and Opus Nocturne, the former of which is probably my personal favorite Marduk album. And it sure ain't even remotely death metal no more. And the new vocalist is fucking awesome, as you're hearing. But more importantly than that, the songwriting manages a very death metal sense of riff-to-riff complexity while still maintaining the black metal style 100% of the time. Even the slow sections have evolved from that sort of mystical doom death into a very atmospheric brand of black metal. Almost kind of a melodic black metal thing, but not full-on dissection. Although it does display a similarly complex level of song architecture as that band. Which basically means that each of these songs features multiple movements, often separated by more doomy riffs, full stops, or that classic bit where one guitar drops out and the other one introduces the new phrase. And there was that awesome bass playing by new bassist B-War, who is one of my favorite bassists from this era of black metal. He's just got this really menacing, thick tone that's very forward in the mix, and he just as often contributes melodies of his own as he does back up the guitars, a major element that sets Marduk apart. Almost nearly as much as their insistence on speed does. I mean, this isn't even like full warp speed Panzer Division Marduk levels of fast, but for 1993, this is definitely some of the most punishing second wave black metal of the Nordic variety available. With that said, particularly compared to later Marduk releases, this is a very melodic and riff-heavy album, and luckily a lot of those riffs are pretty spectacular. My favorite Marduk riff of all time features prominently in the beginning of the song Wolves. That fucking bass drop right there was so sick. Another notable instance of B-War really contributing to this music more than is normal for a black metal bassist. But yeah, this riff is simple and awesome, and the faster, more minimalist transition riff that follows it up is also pretty fucking great. From there we get into probably the only real sort of death metal-ish riff on the album. Not that you'd be able to tell with how much they've sort of blacked it up, particularly with that very Bathory-esque lead guitar. Bathory is always a very important band for these guys. And from there we can see how those mystical doom death sections from their first album have evolved into a sort of mystical doomy black metal. Then back into more fast stuff again, introduced with one guitar and then the other guitar adds to it, bringing in this very fast riff that echoes the melody that opened this song up, while still having its own unique character. This section right here is an even better example of that evolution from mystical doom death in the song's slower moments to a sort of mystical, slow-paced black metal, with a real sense of momentous unfolding and mythic imagination, with these very boldly stated melodies. And as that melody continues to unfold, they bring in like this more mid-paced double bass thing, often sounding a lot like Catatonia back when they were a black metal band, before then moving on into more brutal black metal language. It's stuff like this that actually makes me feel kind of bad for all the times I've kind of goofed on Marduk's later material. Because I gotta say, those are the Unlight, pretty fucking spectacular stuff. Earlier on I mentioned, Marduk, they ain't Burzum, they ain't Branacalled. But as this album goes on, and the more melodic moments start to increase in their frequency, they actually do get surprisingly ambient in their focus, to the point where the longest song on this album is a 7-minute instrumental, the penultimate track, Echoes from the Past. In which, and I don't know if this was because they were smoking too much of whatever Dan Svano was smoking, but most of the song is clean guitar and synths.
And they'll be playing the synthesizer here. Take it away, boys!
Not only that, but it's very well done synthesizer and clean guitar. And I also really like the subtle use of cymbal washes as the song goes on. This is literally the only Marduk song like this, and I think it's pretty cool. And once it hits its emotional climax, they bring back in those super heavy, doomy guitars from the slower black metal sections. And eventually they even start up this really epic sounding melody. It's pretty minimal, especially compared to something you might hear on like a dissection song. But for Marduk, this has some genuine emotional impact. I've hardly heard this song get mentioned at all, even by Marduk fans. And I gotta say, it's a damn shame because this is some pretty cool shit. I don't know, like I said, I think they were hanging out with Dan Swano too much and it rubbed off on them. But I'm glad it did, because part of what makes this the best Marduk album for me is just like the real sense of variety to it. Not really a word you associate with Marduk all that often. The album after this one, Opus Nocturne, is generally held by a lot of the more true cult black metal elitist types to be Marduk's best album, if not, their only good album. Like I said, I kind of like Those of the Unlight a little bit more, but Opus Nocturne is pretty sick. It also is sort of the birth of kind of the stereotypical Marduk sound that we associate with them to this day. Because on those of the Unlight, not only did you have Yoke doing the vocals, he was the drummer. On Opus Nocturne, he switches to exclusively doing vocals, and they bring in Frederick Anderson on the drums, who really establishes the modern Marduk level of speed and brutality. You see, that's fucking fast as hell. Also, the production on this album really lets B-War's bass come out as this absolute shredding force, alongside those razor-edge, thin but not too thin sort of guitars. The production job on this album is just generally outstanding, and they still have the slower, or in this case, more mid-paced sort of moments. Again, with a very sort of epic Bathory-esque feeling. Very nicely done. We'll watch this clean fucking transition here. That shit was fucking sexy. And honestly, pretty cleverly written, especially for such a barbaric sort of band. Returning from those of the Unlight album are their skillful incorporations of more consonant melodic lines, with a very nice sort of echoey, mystical, reverbed out guitar tone. Then back into the fast riffage from earlier before we crash into a very mystical, sort of doomy black metal sounding section. I don't know, man, Marduk is really fucking good at doing slow parts. And I think a lot of that has to do with their mastery of texture. I mean, witness B-War's bass right here, but also the sense of contrast with all the fast, brutal bits. And again, into some more great, clean guitar melodies. This one's pretty simple, just kind of the first few notes of the minor scale harmonized up and down, but it fucking does its job well. Also, I like these rototoms. Opus Nocturne, I mean, even if you turn your nose up at a lot of Marduk's stuff, as well as their fan base, I gotta think even the most curmudgeonly of black metal curmudgeons is gonna find something to enjoy on this release. I mean, fuck, I'm having a good time with it. And it's even got a sequel to my favorite Marduk song from the prior album, Wolves Part 2, Untrodden Paths. It starts out with this very simple, minimalist, sort of ambient floating black metal riff. Almost sounds like something you might hear on a Vaughn album or early Ancient. But from there they introduce some textural variation before then proceeding to bring back one of the faster riffs from the original Wolves. This time around it's even more brutal. And then they hit you with that good shit.
Yeah, boy.
That riff sounds even sicker with this more ambient, kind of floaty production they've got. And then instead of going into a more death metal style riff, they got this absolute black metal monster. I fucking love the slow part in this song. I mean, are you hearing these fucking timpanis? That's some fucking good ass shit, dude. From there into more of a waltz-like sort of melody, which would become another trademark of Marduk going forward. And then we gotta get back to the brutality, cause yeah, it's still fucking Marduk, bro. It's gonna go fast. Guitars will be tremolo picked. Double bass will be blasted. But they still keep it interesting, cause they bring back that waltzy melody from earlier, now with a blast beat under it. Once they get out of the blasting section, it gets, again, almost kind of dissection-y. Definitely very Swedish sort of black metal sound. Opus Nocturne, pretty fucking fantastic album. Those are the Unlight, as mentioned earlier, probably my favorite Marduk album, so obviously that one's good. And even Dark Endless, you know, pretty interesting sort of black metal, death metal, whatever the fuck kind of metal album. Marduk, don't underestimate them. I mean, I do all the time. And yet, pretty much every time I've come back to at least this trio of albums, I've always been pretty impressed. Keep an eye or an ear or whatever open for part 2 of our Marduk series, where we're going to go over the albums with Legion on vocals. Thanks for listening and watching or whatever you did, and I'll see you next time.